Ahora tengo el honor de presentar a Esther Duflo. Ella no solamente es Premio Nobel de Economía del 2019, es la economista más joven que tuvo este premio y además la segunda mujer. Las contribuciones de Esther a las políticas de reducción de la pobreza global y en general su trabajo ha transformado toda la visión de desarrollo en el mundo. So I would like you to say hi, Esther. We are very, very honored that you had time for us today. And without more introduction, please, the floor is yours.
And to talk to you about a topic that I've been thinking a lot lately, which is how we restore trust in these hard times, which have become harder times, which maybe can become more hopeful times. On key issues that the world is facing today, global and local collaboration between citizens, between countries in the world, between businesses, governments, activists, NGOs, social sectors is essential. None of this topic will be able to, or none of this subject we will be able to resolve them without some considerable common work. That includes the pandemic, of course, and the economic issues that are related to that. That includes issues related to globalization, like immigration, trade. That includes the current issues the world is facing today with supply chains issues and inflation and the rise in energy and food prices. That includes, of course, the next huge issues that are about to confront us, which is the rise of inequality and climate change in particular. Now, unfortunately, it's not because we need collaboration and common work that we necessarily will get it, because the world is really suffering from a generalized breakdown in trust. Some of this breakdown in trust you've experienced in Peru. You may have seen these graphs before because they were kindly sent to me by the organizer of the conference, but I think they're quite striking. 68% of respondents to an Ipsos poll in Peru say that corruption is one of the top 3 problems in a country. This is government corruption, but not only. 71% of businessmen are perceived to be corrupt, and 60% of young Peruvians want another type of businessman, whatever it is. 4% of Peruvians only think that companies can take action against corruption. But it's not just Peru, or I think we would be having an entirely different conversation. This breakdown of trust, or this generalized low trust in governments, media, corporations, is something that we're seeing around the world. So in 2020, less than half of citizens worldwide reported in various polls to trust in their national government. And you have here the breakdown a little bit by country. You can see indeed that Latin America has lower number than North America, part of Africa, or Europe, at least Northern Europe. But generally, there are very, very few countries with a very high rate of trust in their governments, and very many countries where it's really quite low indeed. And it's not just government, the same way that it's not Peru, but it's the world over. It's not just government, it's really the key institutions in the countries. In the Elderman Trust Barometer, which relies on polls taken around the world, we see that, as I said before, about less than half of the respondents trust in government. About the same numbers trust the media. But it's not that the trust enjoyed by NGOs or businesses is that much larger. They are just above 50% of people declare trusting their businesses. And just so that you don't think I am talking from this point of view of superiority, economists are actually some of the least trusted people in the whole world. This is a poll from YouGov taken in 2017. And actually did a very similar survey in 2018 in the US. So this is UK data, but the US data was remarkably similar, asking for public trust in experts. And the question was of the following: whose opinions do you tend to trust when they talk about their fields of expertise? The most trusted people were nurses, 84% of people trust them, and doctors. Scientists in general enjoy a high level of trust, 71%. Politicians, we've already seen, are the least trusted people, with 5% of people trusting politicians in general and 20% their local MP. But second to the bottom are economists. Only 25% of people trust economists about economics. I'm not talking about, football or dating sites, but really about economics. This is half of the trust that is enjoyed by weather forecasters. So this has to tell you something about the level of trust enjoyed by economists, especially since this poll was taken in the UK, where the weather is particularly difficult to forecast. So here we go. I'm giving you some lessons about trust, and I'm coming from a profession that is some of the least trusted. So what do we do about all this? First of all, do we need to do something? I think it is critical. Trust in governments, and I'm going to talk also about trust in businesses and academics, in particular academic economists. Trust in government is key for success and the welfare of populations. Why is that? Well, governments is a really unusual position of having to deal with problems that are always difficult. Most successful policy changes are not win-win to start with. They create losers and winners. For example, if you invest in clean energy, which is something that is perhaps very important for the world today, it is not win-win because some people are today working in coal factories, or they are working with petrol. And so they are very worried with what's going to happen to their jobs once energy sources move to cleaner sources of energy like renewables. So even something like investing in renewable that is going to make energy cheaper in the long run and also is going to contribute towards saving the planet, that's not win-win. There is a clear identifiable set of people who will lose from these policies. Now, so this is one example, but trade, of course, international trade is not win-win. There are people who were building furniture in North Carolina in the US who got hammered when China entered the world market. There are probably people who were cultivating flowers who got hammered when Latin America entered the market for flowers. So this is the case for a lot of policy changes. It doesn't mean they don't need to be done because they can often be made win-win by suitable redistributions or other intervention. For example, if someone loses their job due to trade, you can give them money to retrain, to change sector, so that eventually they make more money than they were making before, and they continue on with their lives. But this intervention requires commitment. You can promise a financial compensation, but that can always be denied or expropriated later. Typically, the government is not going to give to, say, someone who lost their job producing furniture one huge lump sum that is going to compensate them for the entire stream of revenue. They can't pay one lump sum compensation when the policy is announced. They will need to do it progressively, first of all, because the government doesn't have money to pay vast amounts of money to everyone. And second, if they gave lump sum compensation, then that would create commitment problems on the other side. Similarly, regulatory changes can be unenforced, can be undone. Living in the US, we live that all the time. One administration passes all sorts of regulations, and then the next administration does them. So commitment requires trust. And if you don't have trust in government, then you cannot commit to make whole people who are going to potentially first order being the victim of some policies that are important and need to be done. So without trust in government, you really cannot do anything deep. You cannot reform an economy. For example, I'm going to give you two obvious examples of where trust in government was relevant. One is the fight against COVID-19. So you can see Peru there on the, unfortunately, on the extreme left and the up high of the graph, because Peru had one of the highest rates of COVID-19 fatality per population, per 100,000 people in this graph. And it's also a country where the trust in the government is the poorest. At the other extreme, you have Thailand or China, where trust in government is high and the COVID-19 deaths were low. Interestingly, it has very little to do with continents. It has very little to do with the level of income of a country. You know, you take Ethiopia, it's a poor country, but it has relatively low COVID deaths and a relatively high trust in government. Or you take South Korea versus the US. You see two rich countries with very different trust in government and very different COVID-19 performance. So the COVID-19 crisis demonstrates to us the immediate impact of having higher trust in government. Another one that is perhaps that we already start to see the impact of is the fight against climate change. Trust is key to fight climate change. Why? Because again, it requires really changing the way that we live, changing the way that we consume, changing the way that we produce energy. These changes are costly. They are going to hurt some people, and these people need to be compensated. And there is very little trust that this compensation will happen. So for example, a proposal for a carbon tax on petrol in France sparked huge protests. The famous Yellow Vest protest was finally scuttled, and in fact the protest continued even after the idea was scuttled, because people were concerned that these increases in tax in petrol prices would not be met with a corresponding redistribution. They were told that they would be made whole, but they didn't believe it. And similarly, in India, when there is a huge overuse of electricity that goes with overuse of water, in particular in Punjab, where the water table is receding because people grow rice, farmers grow rice, which they really shouldn't be growing in this very, very dry country. And they do it by pumping water out of the water table using electricity that is given to them for free. So it is pretty obvious that both for water conservation and for future climate protection, they need to stop doing that. They need to start being charged for electricity so that the true social cost of their activities is reflected in what they do. But of course, that's going to hurt them. So it's only possible if they are compensated. But whenever this is proposed to them, even if it's proposed to them by compensation, farmers are dead set against it. You can see here how the representative for the farmer, Sukhbir Akali Dal, called it a midsummer madness. Like, it's impossible, it won't happen, stopping free power is crazy. Even though, in principle, if it was compensated, it might work out. So this was to convince you of the importance of trust in government. Now, why is government not trusted? And by the way, why are corporations and economists also mistrusted? Starting with governments, I think sometimes we see the extreme reaction. For example, here, keep the government out of my Medicare. And this was from a demonstrations in the US, but the Medicare is a government program. So that shows the fundamental misunderstanding of what governments are doing, and in particular, in this case, running the Medicare. What are governments doing? Governments are precisely intervening when they are trying to do something that the market cannot take care of on its own. For example, they are giving money to people to get health care. That necessarily implies rationing the care for some people who would be allowed to pay, and then in order to be able to give it to some other people. So it is changing sort of the natural flow of the economy where money can buy most things. And therefore, very naturally, money wants to come back and kind of rear its head and try and get the things that it wants anyway, that people want anyway, even if they don't deserve them or they don't need them. That very naturally creates conditions for corruption. And to fight corruption, government put in place red tape. And the red tape is also a consequence. The red tape is also a consequence of trying to do things, controlling people, getting them to do things that they don't want to do. Again, the COVID-19 crisis is a clear example of what only government could do. Shutting down businesses, wearing a mask. These have all externalities. These are individually costly activities, but that are useful for the community. Only a government can impose that. Only government can tax people during good times to put in place economic rescue package or borrow to put them in place in bad times. Only government have enough money to invest for vaccine development. And only governments can allocate vaccines when they are in short supply so that the most fragile get it first. So this gives you all of the example of the type of things only government can do and why they are difficult and why that very naturally leads to risk of corruption and red tape. Not because governments are particularly bad, but precisely because they intervene when they are needed to do that. And some people just do not like it. So this is in the US, some response against COVID-19 regulation. And indeed in the US, trust in government is today at a historically low level. Although it didn't go down in 2021, if anything, it went down a little bit, it went up a little bit in 2021. But generally, we have more and more distrust. But the good news is that in the OECD, it actually has been moving up lately. And in particular, it has been moving up as a consequence of the COVID-19 crisis, which means that people eventually probably realized the importance of a government in this very, very hard time. And to me, that's a silver lining of the pandemic, at least in some countries. I don't know whether that will hold in Peru, but at least in some countries where if the government does a moderately competent job in very difficult circumstances, then people can rally behind it. And then that empowers the same government to act in other times. So that, I think, is one reason of government mistrust, is simply because we are holding the government to a very impossibly high standard, being as efficient as companies, when in fact companies do the normal jobs of what the market would like them to do anyways, and government are trying to solve these problems from hell. But there are also reasons that there are also some ways in which governments are bringing onto themselves this problem. Governments in particular are usually not very transparent about what they do, or why they do it, or how effective it is. And there are some bad reasons for it. Sometimes governments have things to hide. Sometimes government officials feel that the public would not be able to understand their reasoning. Sometimes they believe that the public will thank them later. Those are bad reasons to not be transparent. And then there are some good reasons. Sometimes because you need to run very, very fast and you don't have time to explain. Sometimes because, if you were relentlessly transparent, it would be like a huge flow of information that people would not be able to process. So transparency needs to be selective. And then if everything is made public, there would be so much data that you could actually hide the wrongdoing in the haystack. So sometimes, selective transparency is actually more transparent than overall radical transparency. Another reason why governments are not trusted is actually ideology. Ideology that I must say has been peddled by members of my profession, including a Nobel Prize winner, Milton Friedman, much revered, who made this quip that if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years, there'll be a shortage of sand. That's a funny quote, but this is the type of quote that have sustained this very strong mistrust in government that have legitimized this mistrust. And I think have not been particularly helpful in improving, in fact, the quality of the decision making, because they have made the action of the government even harder. They have, by not generating support for decisions, they have discouraged good people from coming into government by making it unattractive. And, for the reason that I just explained, I think it's just like unfair and incorrect. In fact, Milton Friedman himself is also, I think, to some extent responsible for the low trust in businesses. And relatedly for the low trust in economists, because what he claimed is that businesses have no business doing these hard things that governments are doing. He claimed the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, period. That is ruling out, taking care of the health of the employee. That is ruling out taking care of the planet. That is ruling out the multiple stakeholders that businesses necessarily have when they operate in a country. This has today contributed to the low trust in businesses precisely because people, for example, the people who responded to the poll in Peru, I think were pretty convinced that this is what business think it's happening. And also that businesses would do anything to increase their profits, including trample their rights or trample the responsibility of the planet. By insisting on this kind of very limited role of the businesses, by the inability of governments to do just about anything, what Milton Friedman did is to some extent create a very, very narrow role for anyone to do anything about market inefficiency, market imperfection, coming from externalities from the environment. And this is so limiting, this is so unrealistic at some level that it has also contributed to the mistrust in the last professions I wanted to study today, which is economists. It has contributed to the idea that economists are essentially sold to businesses, that they are there to legitimize their very narrow objectives to the detriment of population. And that's one reason why economists as well are not trusted. The other is that a lot of people rightly think that economists are mostly in the business of forecasting, like weather forecaster for the economy. But as another economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, said, economic forecasting is just terrible. He wrote here the script, the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. So here, if you compare the IMF forecast or the consensus of forecasters, just to not cast particular stone on the IMF, you can see that in the run-up to a recession, the year before, 1 year before the recession, the IMF still forecasted 3% growth. Even in October of the recession, so that 9 months into the year of the recession, the IMF still underestimates the extent of the recession. So the IMF is bad at predicting the future, and remarkably, it's bad at predicting even the present, which would explain why people have a very low opinion of economists if they think that's what most economists do. So how do we fix that? Well, I think we fix that by having government, economists, and businesses work together to improve the effectiveness of policy. Of course, fighting corruption is important. Although every government in the world faces the corruption pressure that I discussed, the perception of corruption, at least, are very different from countries to countries. Tend to be people who live in Western democracy tend to have a better opinion of their government. People who live in Latin America, the perception of corruptions are very high. And there are things we can do to fight corruption. And there are things that government should do to fight corruption. Many of these things we've had a chance to evaluate in Japan. Transparency, making sure that people in Indonesia, when people were aware of their rights because they receive a card showing them for their right for a social program, leakage diminished by 30%. Direct payment, instead of having multiple layers of government, direct transfer to government led to substantial savings for government as well as more money to the people. Incentives for tax collection. In Pakistan, a small incentive to property tax collector led to an increase in 30% in receipts. So all of these things suggest that corruption is not something, despite the difficulty in government action, corruption is something that we can fight by being pragmatic about it. But I think it is important to go beyond corruption and to focus on effectiveness. The problem that government faces and the reason for the low trust in government is not just that people think that governments are corrupt, but it is mainly, as well, and perhaps mainly, that they think that neither the government nor major corporation can do much about the problem about solving problems. So here you can see a poll from the US where corruption perceptions are low, trust in government is also very low. So the reason that caused the low trust in government is that only 7% of people think that the government can have a very positive impact in solving the biggest problem facing the countries. And only 37% think a somewhat positive impact. Corporation is not much better. 9% think they can have a very positive impact. On the other hand, if you look at science and technology, 43% of people think that science can help. And in total, 74% of people think that college and universities can help. So clearly, we need to get science and technology, we need to get university to work with major corporation and the government to make any difference. And this is where my work comes in. My work comes in by bringing the power of science, the power of randomized evaluation, take a scientific approach to design and to select effective policy. So that improves the trust in economists because you don't have economists doing, predicting the future anymore. We are into the details and the nitty-gritty of policy design. That improves the trust, that should improve the trust in government because you are actually evaluating policy and selecting the best one. So the work of JPAL, my lab, is really, the model is science at the service of policy, is to evaluate public policy, to find out what are the important policy questions that people have, and to conduct policy outreach. So we draw lessons for policy from across all the studies to generate public goods for policy outreach. And there is examples of this work already conducted for several years in Peru. A great example is a joint effort between the Ministry of Education, researchers, JPAL, Latin America, and IPA for Peru, to create Mini-Du Lab. It's an innovation lab to design, test, and scale education programs. This work generated the design and evaluation of 13 programs in the scale-up of 3 of them that were particularly effective. How does it work? People come up with an idea. The idea is tested rigorously with a randomized evaluation in hundreds of schools. If it's effective, the idea is scaled up to other places, and if it's not scaled up. So this cycle can create trust because it creates transparency. This is what worked, what didn't work. It creates more effectiveness, and it creates a scale up of what is effective. Other example, gender-based violence. There is a joint effort between the Peruvian Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Population, IPA again, and JPAL again, to design, test, and scale programs to reduce intimate partner violence. And for Latin America more generally, improving light-to evidence. So COVID-19 has affected women's labor participation in a disproportionate manner. Through foundation, financing by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Target Foundation, we got money to allocate research funds to find innovative ways for incorporating women, understanding the challenges and the barriers that they face around the world, including in Latin America. This work can be done in collaboration with businesses. For example, a student of mine is working in India with Microsoft Research to provide a gig work for women so that they can work from home. Another student is working with a market, with a carpet manufacturer to find out what prevents women to come being trained and work in a carpet factory. And of course, this kind of work can also be done with government. So in conclusion, how do we restore trust? We restore trust by being pragmatic, by collaborating, and by having humility. Government can regain trust by being transparent and rigorous in what works, what does not work to improve the lives of their citizens, by trying things, by saying whether it works, and by scaling what works. Economists can regain trust by working with governments on such issues and behaving more like pragmatic plumbers than like astrologists, predicting the future. And businesses can regain trust by collaborating on these projects and by not undermining government's credibility and effort, by recognizing that they need the government to do things that the market cannot provide. But they are also very key role for the market, and that this effort themselves can be evaluated and accompanied by rigorous research. Thank you very much, and I wish you good luck in your future work. So I'm going to stop sharing now, that's okay?
Thank you very much, Esther. I was wondering, do you have some minutes for questions?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I think that you really, we have discussed in the last 3 days the idea of trust. Peru is in a 3 crises. We have a sanitary crisis, a political crisis, an economic crisis. And what you say about trust in government is very important. And in Peru, we are in a perverse, I was a public servant myself most of my life, and if we consider that the very important public services like health and education are intensive in human capital. Most of improving education is improving what's happening on the classroom with a teacher. So I was wondering, based in your research, have you identified best practices or good policies to implement maybe the public service career or incentives to doctors and teachers, so everything related to human capital in government in general?
Yes, so I think the situation are quite different from country to countries, but so I would not presume talking about Peru specifically, but there are always a few things. I think one thing that is terribly demoralizing for teachers and for doctors, for example, is the sense that their mission is not possible to accomplish, or that they are not respected in the discharge of this mission. So for example, in many countries, in particular in former colonies, the curricula the official curricula are so demanding that there is really no way for teachers to actually complete them. And if at the same time that's the only incentive that they are provided really is based on did you manage to cover the curriculum. So what teacher will do then is to focus on a very small minority of children that have a chance to understand and forget everyone else. And this system, instead of creating more people who know more because we have this ambitious curriculum, creates a huge waste of people who have gone to school for many years, who have bought into the education dream, but are not provided education that they can follow. And it's actually those same teachers can suddenly become super effective simply by making clear that they have to teach at the right level, they have to teach at the level where the children are. And if they do that, they see progress of the children, and you suddenly see kind of a virtuous cycle of teacher being more motivated, student doing better, and teacher doing more motivated. And in my experience, that works better, for example, than to say, oh, we are, the standard tools of giving financial incentives to the teacher. Because teachers in particular, civil servants in general, are usually not drawn to the profession mainly by, just by money. Mm-hmm. They are into this because they're looking for a mission. And when this mission loses its sense, first of all, you don't get the best people to come teach, because they don't, nobody think they can succeed. And second, the people who are in the profession don't do as well as they could have done.
Esther, you mentioned that trust is built little by little, and I assume rebuilding trust is even harder. On top of that, yesterday, Mike Hardy from Cambridge mentioned that corruption is toxic for societies, and you cannot build a society unless at least a huge part of that corruption is taken out of the equation. As societies in general, but specifically in Peru, we're like in this vicious circle, when we've lost trust among ourselves, plus there's a lot of corruption all over the place. How to figure out how to move away of that vicious circle, and who makes the first move in order to go away from that circle?
That's a great question. I think anybody really, anybody makes the first move. The key is to not, what you said about little by little, is to not wait until you have the magic bullet. It's not going to be a magic bullet, it's going to be many, many silver pellets. So in fighting corruption, it's small things. In regaining, the trust and the dedication of civil servants, it's small things. And then one by one, and not even all of these small things will work, but some will work, and then, you're going to build from that. And I know, I wish I could give you some kind of more radical view, but at some level it is radical pragmatism in a sense, which is like, don't get discouraged because the problem seems very big, because you take it by any part and you're going to make small progress, and from this small progress you're going to change that situation, and then that's going in turn to generate the virtuous circle. The virtuous circle don't have to happen at the level of the economy. They can be quite local. For example, I gave you the Indonesia example where they have this rice distribution program. Indonesia in general suffers from very high corruption level. It's an effective economy but full of corruption. And one of this corruption was really plaguing this rice distribution program. And the central government that funds the program was really trying to do something about the corruption that's mostly happening at the local level when it's implemented at the local level. And they had this idea that it's enough for people to know what they are eligible for. So that seems to be a very small step. And they gave people cards with, so-and-so, Esther is eligible for this program, for the rice and the price at which I should pay. And then they ran an evaluation of this program. They compared several versions, and in one version they also put posters in the village to say that the cards had been distributed. And in that version, you had really this virtuous circle kicking off, because the official knew that the people knew that the official knew what they were entitled to. And that creates that, virtuous circle, and then the level of corruption really went down, and people got much more rice. And without costing the government anything, because it mainly come out of the pocket of the local government officials. And when that program was shown to be effective, it was immediately scaled up to 70 million people. So it's a small thing, but it's a small thing that makes a big difference, and that shows sort of the power of things to build on each other, even at a small level. So I think you start like that and kind of try and make your snowball become bigger and bigger.
Yeah, so do you really think the snowball effect should work?
Yeah, I think it works both ways.
Yeah.
I take your point that there are long shadows of episode of mistrusts. For example, trust in public health in India is still low because people still remember forced sterilization during the emergency period. So there are these long shadows. They create limits to what we can do, but that makes it even more important to try everything we can do to fight these things.
Esther, I was wondering, we concentrated a lot of trust in government, but also, and I think that you show some data on trust in the private sector, and how citizens in Peru, the trend is that especially younger generations are losing a little bit of trust in companies and corporations. Based on your research, do you have some recommendations on how to move forward on building trust among like the private sector with citizens?
So I can't say that I have anything based on my research because I haven't really done anything on that or seen anything on that. But I think you're right, and I think it's really a problem that needs to be addressed because corporations are such an important part of the economic landscape that, and even though, as I said, they are not necessarily dealing with the hardest bit, what they do, they should be able to do well, and people should have a sense that they are rooting for them. So I can tell you what I think, but I think one needs to try things out. But I think it really has to be action, and it has to be action that people can see. It's not going to be sufficient to write glossy reports about how such and such companies really trust the environment. It has to be transparency in what salaries are being paid. It has to be transparency on what are the CO2 emission and pollution and things like that. And some of the things I think government can and maybe should impose. For example, the EPA at some point imposed to firms that they have to release their pollution statistics. I think it would be good to have a lot of kind of a framework that impose a level playing field on these very basic things to firms, so that you don't rely on always the same people to be the good cops while everybody else is continuing to run in the wild world. I think it's very difficult for firms, for companies to not listen to their shareholders. So even if companies would like to have multiple stakeholders, it's the very natural tendency will be to go back to shareholders. And that's where, citizens, governments can play a role by creating the forces that create the right framework for everybody to behave in a transparent way, to respect laws, and to in this way respect both the public and the environment.
Esther, one last question. On the first slide of your presentation, you shared your book, Good Economics for Hard Times. Then you scratched the hard part, and you said going from hard to harder to most hopeful times. Are you hopeful?
Oh, I put a question mark on hopeful.
That's why I'm making the question.
It depends a little bit on the day. So this book was written mostly in 2017, 2018. It was published in November of 2019 in the US. So certainly the times were, and I've made a productive career telling people economists are very bad at predicting things. And then I published a book in November 2019 that talks about hard times, and in 2020 we are in this COVID pickle. So things became harder, but then they improved. So I thought, well, it's a little bit better now. And so I scratched that and I put more hopeful. And then I put a question mark today, actually, thinking, well, there are a lot of things that are not going straight. So this is kind of the evolution of my thinking. But I think we can and should retain hope, because if you look at the big scale of things, look at over the several decades, the last 3 decades, for example, or since 1990, and you look at the poorest people in the world, which really is the people we should care the most about, you would agree with me, I hope, then their life has really improved in a significant way. That's true in Peru. That's true in the world at large. With infant mortality going down, maternal mortality going down, extreme poverty going down, people going to school, the quality of school improving. From countries to countries, for various different reasons, different mechanisms, things have been looking up over several decades. Then, of course, COVID-19 crisis happened. In Peru, you have your own set of political crises that pile up one onto the other. But if you look at the long run, it's been possible to make progress. And I think it's been possible to make progress thanks to people, you know, like you, for example, who have been pragmatic policymakers making differences. So that makes me hopeful. I think we still have this cohort, this generation of people. We have a lot of people who want to make a difference, who have, you know, healthy skepticism, but who can be put to work to do things better. So I think we have to retain hope.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Esther. It has been a pleasure for us to have some time in your agenda today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
You.
Bye.